Well, I think I'll get started, and thank you for coming. This is a small group, but it's the right group, it's the right people, and I'm just so honored that Professor Kreisberg is here. And I owe a lot to what you founded many years ago, and I'll talk about that. But I'm going to keep this a little bit more informal because of the size of the group, and just start by saying thank you for coming and taking the time to hear my story, but also thank you to Syracuse University for thank you. The wonderful career that I've had has been because of much of what I learned here. There were some things that happened during my time at Maxwell that I absolutely believe contributed in many ways to the success I've had. I am also particularly excited for the students who are here because I think you're going to use the tools and techniques that you learn through PARCC and have much greater success than I was able to. There were a lot of times early in my career when I tried things and got referred to as Sister Kate or the do-gooder because it was not the typical approach to solving a problem. And what I see you in entering an environment where the technology and the access to international relationships and best practices is going to allow you to go much faster in being able to introduce some of what you're learning here and have even greater success. So my career is one example. I think that much of what I experienced is not going to be your experience, but I hope you maybe can pull some threads from it that you'll find useful. I'm in the midst of Tom Friedman's new book. Have any of you seen it? Thank you for being late. Make sure you read it because it is an absolutely excellent study of what's happening in our careers because of technology and the absolute acceleration at the rate at which information is coming to us. So I start every time I do this presentation talking about knowing who you are, because that's one of the first things I learned when I came to PARCC. One of the Tavistock classes out in Casanova forced me to go through some things that clearly put in front of me what some of the challenges of a firstborn type A personality were going to be in trying to be a leader. And if I didn't find a way to check those behaviors, I was going to spend a career rolling over everyone. And I still fall back into that occasionally, but much of what I learned at PARCC helped me at very important times to stop and ask some questions, which I'll talk about in a bit. And it's really important to have a balanced background that I think brings as much experience to the work that you're doing as possible. So for me, Lemoyne and Maxwell, and I put PARCC up there proudly. I was talking about the fact I spoke at a conference at NYU last year, and I had the opportunity to talk about what PARCC's work was to this international group. I've worked in non-governmental organizations, government, and healthcare, so I've really had the full breadth of experience. And now I'm paying a lot of attention to this work that's happening internationally called Relational Coordination, led by a professor out of Brandeis, but it is really now filtered across many universities, both in the United States and in Europe, and is being funded by a company out of Canada called Salus Global. It's a quality company, very interested in quality in healthcare. And they're putting the finances of their company behind trying to develop this movement around leadership in healthcare occurring differently. And I had a chance to spend some time with their CEO at that conference. So from all of those educational experiences, I entered a career having really two philosophies that I was going to build my career on. One is servant leadership, the work of Robert Greenleaf. If you've not had a chance to look at it, I encourage you to do that. It's really a particular perspective about how to lead and making sure that you see yourself in service to the people who are part of your organization or your community versus you're there to tell them how life is going to be. And then secondly, the work around reflective listening and conflict resolution. Most physicians refer to it as that thing you do. They don't know how to put a name on it, but they say, you get a look, You get up to the board and you start diagramming a different approach. And it's that work that I think really has helped break through in a number of different areas. Know yourself as a leader, be reflective and agile, and know when it's time for another leader. I spent almost 2 years thinking through that last bullet point, and still some more thinking to do about that, but that could be a lecture unto itself. And make sure that you're creating focused time for personal development. I have a daughter who graduated from the Whitman School and the I School, is now in San Francisco, and I'm watching the way that she balances this incredible work that she's doing and much more agile and flexible around balance. Last night, Professor Bertini hosted a presentation with Professor Hartsock on the Blackstone project that's here at Syracuse University, which if you don't know about it, you gotta go see it. They're in the library doing some really fabulous things. But she talked about your generation and the difference in how you're approaching this. I was just so impressed with what I heard last night, and I think there is good work happening here at the university around this, and I'm so impressed that someone chose to put it in the library rather than house it in a particular college. Fascinating. So, most of you are just trying to figure out how to finish your degree here. At some point, if you were in a leadership position or you're going into a leadership position, what are you going to do with your vision, your position, and influence as you go through your career? One of the things that I think your generation can do earlier than I could is use your position to speak up in a way that challenges how problem solving is being done. My career largely was you kind of worked your way up through the system, and when you got high enough in an organization, then you could challenge. I think you have the freedom to do it much earlier. And when I say challenge, it's questioning the way a problem is being solved. Who's at the table? Who's been invited to participate? Have we listened and looked for the best practices before we dive in? We were talking earlier, great example of how not to do it this week with United. The CEO has absolutely blown it at every level. And while that was going on, I was dealing with Delta, trying to book a trip to Africa. Delta had a bad week the week before. Their hub had bad weather. They are literally 3 hours behind on calls. I got called back. I got my problems solved. Yeah, they were in crisis, but clearly somebody was setting a framework for how they were solving problems that said, put the customer first. Let's watch that one carefully, because I think there's going to be a lot of opportunities. So, ask questions about how a problem is being approached in terms of what best practices are we aware of. The technology allows you to do that so much faster now than we could early in my career, but you've got to do it. You've got to ask the question to say who's doing it better. And Syracuse, New York State, the United States are not the world. There's so many opportunities, and I'm finding, particularly in my experience in healthcare, great work being done in other countries. I think the United States in many ways has fallen behind some of the innovations that I'm seeing in other parts of the world. Achieving operational excellence, I'll talk about that in a bit. It's a new world. And those in leadership positions, I don't care what the discipline is, have to find different ways to approach operational excellence. Things are changing too quickly, particularly around technology and some of the discoveries that are happening related to the sciences, that you have to approach it can't be top down. It's got to be a team collaborating, looking for those best practices to improve the organization. Growth opportunities and innovation. Most organizations, again, I don't care what the discipline is, I think healthcare struggles with this the most, don't articulate how innovation is going to happen or where it's going to happen. I met a CEO in the Midwest who had started Wizard School. Every new employee went through Wizard training, and then you had to rotate through one of the Wizard committees. It was their innovation project. It was the way they were constantly looking for ways to improve healthcare. But if it's not articulated, if it's not a process, it's by accident, and that's got to change. And then broader context, changes and trends, technology, social norms, policy, and regulation. I've mentioned to several people that I spent a lot of time in my career solving problems. And when St. Joseph's joined Trinity, one of the executives there said to me, "Kathy, you've done a great job, but you missed something." So what did I miss? Well, let's take the example of the Smoking Cessation Center. St. Joseph's ran it for 20 years, did a very good job convincing people not to smoke, providing tools, drugs, other kinds of therapies. Do you know what the thing you can do in a community that will, faster than anything, reduce smoking is? It's a policy. Raise the age at which people can buy cigarettes. And we had spent 20 years doing the right operational things without addressing the policy issues. And so Trinity's approach has been nationally to take every issue and really dissect the policies that will help move that solution forward. And during the last round of Academy Awards, went to every director and said, will you sign on to agreeing not to promote cigarette smoking in your next film? And they got 10 directors to agree to do it. Maybe a small step, but certainly I think one that's important. So those are things that when I say consider different perspectives, those are voices that you can use early in your career, no matter the position. This is where I intend to spend the next chapter of my life. Really assessing risk in organizations through a more collaborative model. This environment, I talked about Tom Friedman's book, you're experiencing it every day. This environment is changing so quickly. There's so much more information. Leaders cannot possibly be experts in everything. How do you develop a framework in an organization that has you looking at risk on an annual basis, semi-annual basis, and then working that into the life of the organization? Not waiting for the crash. Not waiting for the conflict that results in a war. Not waiting for the bad outcome to react, but building a framework that allows you to assess differently. Facility risks. Oh my gosh, the number of things that any organization is now beginning to think about, from even terrorism threats. Yet how many organizations sit down and really do that assessment? It tends to be those that have been hacked first. We've got a lot of people paying off ransoms now when their systems are hacked, rather than doing the work up front to say, how are we going to react if that happens? Health and safety risks, reputation risks. Back to United, I'll use a personal example. I have found that when you're presented with something in the media now, my framework has always been, make sure you understand what the issue is, do your homework, look at the best practices before you open your mouth on camera. It doesn't work anymore. Social media has it out in the public realm so quickly that leaders have to be prepared, even if to say, here's what we know, I'll be back when I know more. But to not say anything is not acceptable anymore. It allows another narrative to be written that is likely not the right narrative. And so again, back to that notion of assessing risk. You know, what are the threats that any organization could face? And it's so different from organization to different communities to different disciplines. But I think the work is pretty common in how you approach it. And it shouldn't be top down. It should include the entire organization. I had a chance to spend a little bit of time with the president of Syracuse Research Corporation, spinoff of Syracuse University. And they literally involve every single employee in the organization, big group meetings over the course of several days, and they do a full enterprise-wide risk assessment that is fed to the board of directors and lays the agenda for how they're going to operate over the next year. I think about this United incident and wonder what was the work that was done around if we have to bump people, how we're going to play it out. And what was the algorithm that took it all the way to the extreme of saying, what if someone says no? How are we going to manage it? My guess is that never happened. It stopped someplace early on without assessing the reputation risk that that organization is now going to face. Compliance and corporate integrity, just a huge exploding area, particularly in healthcare, but not just in healthcare. Anyone who does any work with the government. And I think that this is a particular area around patents and around some of the sciences where I think we're using old tools for how we even issue a patent, and things are going worldwide quickly. How do you assess that risk and be able to manage in a different environment and financial competition? But I think you understand the point I'm trying to make, which is leaders, generally when you're prepared for a leadership role, this notion of assessing risk is not on anybody's agenda. And if you Google it and you go out and start looking, there are a couple of enterprises, a couple of industries that do a lot of work. One is insurance. Tom, do you know why?
They're obligated.
They're obligated to. Government required them to. And the defense industry, because, again, they were required to. But other industries without that requirement have not addressed this at all. This other area of driving operational excellence, I think also lends itself to what you're learning at PARCC, which is, again, if you want to improve in any area, who knows best how to improve workflow? The people who are doing the work. And how do we build structures? I used to say to the staff all the time, I really don't care what framework you pick. Baldrige Award, JACO certification, Lean. Doesn't matter to me what the framework is, but pick one. How are we going to make sure we're challenging ourselves to do better operationally? Supply chain, workforce management, coordination of care. Again, I think the tools that PARCC offers are going to be immensely helpful in doing that. I loved my time at Maxwell. Great experience, great professors, but I feel very strongly that the 2 classes I took at PARCC are what gave me the basis to be able to think through, whether it be vision, strategy, or operations, how to think about approaching it differently. So I'm hoping someday a student will come and tell me how to frame this in a way that's a little bit more elegant than up, down, left, right. But literally, this is how my brain has worked for the 30 years that I've been doing leadership in this community, and this came from my experience at PARCC. Any problem, any crisis, whether it be a 911 center, how to put the village together again after a very long strike, how to get an organization to think about a relationship, a merger with another organization. Didn't matter what the issue is. Up, down, left, right. Who above me, regulatory bodies, board, who reported to me, who was in the organization, who was outside the organization. Every time I took this approach to solving a problem, making sure the table was set well with the right people, the right gender, the right age, the right community experience, every time I took this approach, problem solved. Every time I didn't take this approach, I picked up the pieces for the next year. I backtracked. I had to spend a lot of time and energy doing what I should have done initially. And I think this is not generally the way I find most CEOs approach leadership. They tend to come to a conclusion, decide what's going to happen, and dive in. And then are surprised when there's a community reaction, or surprised when they can't get buy-in that they needed to. This has been just immensely helpful. I actually had some leaders on a national level, a meeting I was at when I started walking through this, taking pictures of it, emailing it back to get their strategy people to look at how they might use it. So I think the advantage for you as students is the complexity and the opportunity in this new world is going to help you move faster, but I think it's going to present some challenges that you need to think about very carefully. We were talking last night about multitasking and how great you all are at being on 5 different technologies at the same time, but it has a stress impact on health that I don't think has adequately been studied. So be a role model for reflective listening. Any meeting you're in, any problem that's being approached, listen to the other side. And if the other side isn't in the room, go find it and listen to it. Make sure you understand how people who are not like you are thinking about a particular problem. Insist on diversity of opinion at every table. So often, we surround ourselves with people who think like we do, who we're comfortable with, who we know. Go find people who think different than you do about a problem. It will improve the outcome immensely. When a group's making a decision, has discernment been included? Particularly in this country, we have a tendency to want to hit go as quickly as possible. Have people taken the time to really think through adequately? It's a balance. You can't take too much time when you've got the media or you've got the public demanding a quick response. But when discernment is built into a process, it improves the outcome immensely. Be present to all stakeholders. Take personal time to walk in other shoes. One of the first things I did when I went to St. Joseph's is I walked the neighborhood with the neighbors. We had a big master plan we were about to implement, and said to the neighbors, how are we doing? What do you think? And they said, we think you don't care about us. You park all over the streets, you park and block our driveways. We had planned a parking garage at the end of this huge project. We flipped it. We did the parking garage first. That brought immense goodwill in the community for then the 10 years of projects that followed. I remember that first meeting was not very pleasant. There were not a lot of happy people. We had a very poor reputation in the community. By the end of the process, our neighbors were very much supporting what we were doing and cheering us on. And there's a business case for all this work. And I discovered the business case when we went to recruit an entire new IT department. We were ripping and replacing our technology, and we had to hire 100 very talented technology people in Syracuse that would agree to come for a 2-year period of time. And people said to me, it's going to be a disaster. You're not going to be able to recruit. You're going to have huge challenges. We hired them overnight. And time again, the HR department said the candidates were telling them, this is an organization with vision. That was the business case. And so it's something I think that if you can relate it back to the business case, it helps more buy-in quickly. And be calm. Probably, how many firstborns? Do we have any in there? Hard lesson for firstborn, who tends to be the person who wants to solve all the problems, make it happen quickly. But this environment is so fast-paced, if there isn't a calm voice of reason in the room, not going to have as good an outcome as the person who's saying, let's just take enough time to make sure the right people are in the room, that we've looked at the best practices, we've considered how else we might approach solving this, and then go for a final solution. So I am immensely grateful for having had I think a very successful career, not completely done. A couple things I want to do, as I mentioned, particularly around risk assessment. Very grateful for my experience here at Syracuse University, but I'd love to take some questions and talk a little bit more about your experience at PARCC and how you're using the tools that you're gaining here. So, question for me.
Well, I was kind of curious about the risk assessments, and building those within the organization. And I was just kind of curious if you had some suggestions, because I think maybe some of the apprehension to do a risk assessment is potentially even just fear of punishment. I think sometimes within an organization, if the culture's not flexible, then you may have people who are afraid of like making a mistake and being found out, and that leads to more problems. So, you know, how do you go about sort of like building this within your organization and kind of like uncoupling that sort of that fear of punishment, because ultimately in order to do a risk assessment you have to have transparency and information. So I was just kind of curious in your experience, or if you had any stories about that, or suggestions.
I've actually had this conversation with organizations who've said to me, but if we do that and we find things, then we're going to have to do something about it. And yeah, that's the point of it, but a fear of the additional work that it was going to create. So, you know, I think I am beginning to believe it starts with a conversation about what are we seeing in this environment right now. Got lots of examples besides United, who I've been picking on a lot, lots of examples of people who've had bad outcomes because they did not adequately assess risk. I think we've had 7 hospitals in the United States pay ransoms because they got hacked. We've had Legionella outbreaks. Look at the city of Flint and what they've been. You're from Michigan. So I was in Flint the day that they found out they had a water problem. And it was a foundation in their community who decided to take on trying to set the table differently. And they were trying to get the hospital and the community at the table. That's why I was there. But it's finding the right leverage point, finding the person in the organization who's equally concerned, who's got enough power base that they can move the issue. And then I think a conversation about what's happening different in our environment that's a threat to our organization. I think the threats now to not addressing it so far outweigh doing it that it's not the same kind of challenge that I had in my career, getting people to think about it differently. So start with a conversation and some examples of people who didn't do it well, and some examples of people who've done it well. And I think Syracuse Research is a good example of someone who's done it well.
I have a comment and a question. I often talk about building an infrastructure, acting proactively, but I think the emphasis on a risk assessment, the way of framing it is very ingenious, because that makes it seem like, you know, if you build in right away that there's a reason for looking around and thinking proactively, because there are risks. But the question then is, there are lots of risks. How do you handle setting priorities among them?
So a tool that I learned someplace in my career, I don't remember where, was open architecture, you know, literally taking on a wall and laying out all the opportunities and then collaboratively deciding what are the top 3. You can't do everything, you know, and I think any organization probably has a tolerance for about addressing 3 over the course of a year. So, you know, can we agree from the get-go, these are the 3 for this year, everything else goes in the parking lot to look at in future years? And that has tended to, people pretty much coalesce around the same 3 issues, as long as they can see the process playing out and they feel that they've had some contribution to it. And the things you learn going through open architecture, things that you just don't even realize. Some of it even can go over here to get solved immediately.
Will you talk a bit more about work-life balance? Now, you said from what we learned from the speaker yesterday that people of different generations have gotten this down better, but I don't totally believe that myself. So you had those concentric circles before. But would you just talk about how as you move up the ladder, you try to ensure that, and also how you build that culture within your own organization, so people aren't knocking themselves out. It's not part of the culture.
There, you know, when I say, I think there's more conversation going on than ever I experienced in my career. I listen to my daughter, I listen to my daughter's friends, and I think they are much more attentive to balance and lifestyle and making decisions about jobs from places other than economics. So it may not be perfect. I worry the technology is interfering a little more than it should with the balance, but I think there is at least a better conversation. One thing I did not do well in my career is I would always say family first. Anybody who's ever worked around me has heard me use that expression. Yet my personal style after my daughter was raised was to work very hard, work a lot of hours, multiple projects. And I found that even though I said family first and don't do what I do, I've already raised my family, people follow the leader. And so people were, I found, getting a little burnt out from my particular style. And I think it's something that you just have to be very, very sensitive to and think about how you're going to support that conversation in a different way. Yoga in the workplace, stress management in the workplace, making sure the insurance that you offer to your employees covers as broad a spectrum of complementary medicine as possible. And as the CEO, adjusting your behavior so that you do reflect what you want to have happen in the workplace. So,
organizational adaptation as opposed to damage control.
yes.
It's nice to offer psychotherapy to people that you've driven crazy, but how do you tune the organization in such a way that the changing expectations of your employees match the job that somebody from a different generation held? And I see that most clearly with respect to physician behavior. The young docs coming out, new grads, it's a 4-day-a-week job, 40 hours a week, and call maybe every third weekend, but not really.
Yeah.
And when I look back at physicians who started to practice, my wife started to practice medicine longer ago than she would admit. And when she got a residency, she was on call every other night. She worked, she got up in the morning, 6 o'clock, went to the hospital, made rounds, went to the office, saw patients all day, went back to the hospital, made rounds, and then did deliveries in the meantime.
Yeah.
Nobody will do that anymore.
Yeah.
But we've calibrated the physician job to that kind of schedule.
Yeah. And then add lean in, and we're leaning people out of the processes to make them more efficient. So again, for the students in the room, you're going to live this. There's a talent war coming. There are going to be more jobs than we have people for.
So I'll work really harder, then I'll get the job.
You will have an opportunity to choose jobs that reflect the balance that you want to achieve in your life. And organizations that don't adjust to what's coming are not going to have a workforce. I think particularly with physicians, I am so distressed at how many physicians have retired, left the profession. I think I can't tell you how many physicians say, if I could do anything else other than practice medicine, I would do it. We've absolutely destroyed the practice of medicine in this country, and if we don't address the issue, we're going to have a real challenge going forward. Because right now, students are coming in and saying, here's what I will do, and if you don't offer it, I'll go someplace else, without the organization saying, okay, how do I address that and make sure you want to be here, that I need you to do these things, this is what I need you to focus on, but I'll, in exchange, make sure you have that balance.
But we've designed the organization around expectations that are unrealistic for the next generation.
I agree with you.
And
I agree.
If you do pivot every time and live in a world of damage control, or do you step ahead and say we're going to redesign the delivery in such a way that the jobs are attractive?
Healthcare, someone used the example to me, we're trying to rebuild the airplane while we're flying it, and we're not doing so well with it. That's where I think we need to look at the best practices of other countries there are some places that have addressed some of these issues and are doing quite well in the provision of healthcare as well as attracting people to practice in the profession. So, not so much in this country. Yes.
I'm Aaron. I remember when I attended the UN class by Professor Bettini, she spoke of the need as a manager not to bring too many people on the table because that sort of affects your efficiency in a way. And then I'm looking at the diagram which was talking about up and down, left and right, how do you sort of, in determining who comes to the table and leaving out certain people, how do you still, what are some skills which you can use to still keep those who may not come to the table still excited about the new solutions or strategies that you come up with, in a sense that they'll not feel that you do not deem them as important to sit on the table, but still at the end of the day, how do you keep them energized to support your new initiatives going forward?
So I would suggest that in any project, you have to draw the algorithm. You've got to draw the tree of how it's going to work. I'll use the example again of the 911 center here in Syracuse. It had not happened. An emergency system had not been created for 22 years because the firemen, policemen, and the EMTs fought it. They couldn't agree. We created a process with 3 firemen, 3 EMTs, firemen, policemen, EMTs, 3 of each, 1 neutral facilitator. They had 6 months to come up with a solution. And at the end of the rainbow was a pot of money to fund it. They held focus groups. They did surveys. They did community town hall meetings. But we had planned that all at the beginning. Here's how we're going to make sure we get input. But it's only going to be this group of 10 that's really going to make the decision at the end of the day. I think any studies I've ever seen, 7 or less is the right group to guide a process to a decision. The more, every person you add over 7, you decrease your chances of getting to a final solution. People need to feel heard. They don't necessarily have to be present at everything, but they need to see from the beginning that they're going to be heard and it's going to be valued in the process. So I think you can do that if you plan it from the beginning, if you tree it out. I do culturally, there are, I think, variations that have to be looked at. I've done a little bit of international relief work and stumbled a couple of times because I didn't call Professor Bertini to know that I shouldn't be sneaking things in through the Dominican Republic. But you learn. I think that the more though you can plan it from the beginning, the better chance you have of getting to success. Can I answer your question? Okay. There's software that will help you do that as well. Mindly. I'm trying to think of I've played with 2 or 3 of them over the years, but any project management software will help you do that as well. Questions? Okay, well, I think we're there. Thank you very much for taking time to come hear the story, and thank you, PARCC, for helping me be successful in Syracuse University, Professor Jennifer, and very much appreciate having the opportunity to talk to you today. Good luck to all of you.